Was Martin Luther King Jr.? By Bonnie Bader. Illustrated by Elizabeth Wolfe. Martin started his job as the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on September 1st, 1954. In his sermons, he persuaded church members to register to vote. Voting was one way to change unjust laws. He also encouraged them to join the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP is one of the oldest civil rights groups in the United States. It was formed on February 12th, 1909. Its purpose is to help minorities get equal and fair treatment when they look for a job, buy a home, or apply to a school. These are just a few examples of civil rights. After living in Montgomery for about a year, Coretta gave birth to a little girl, Yolanda Denise. Martin called her Yoki for short. Now the Kings were a family. Yoki. Y-O-K-I. That's a cute little name. Only 2 weeks after Yolanda was born, something happened that changed U.S. history. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old black woman named Rosa Parks got on a bus in Montgomery. Instead of going to the back of the bus, she sat down in the seat at the front. Not even the middle. The bus driver told her to move, but Rosa Parks refused. And she was arrested. That's sad. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was born in Tuskegee, Alabama, on February the 4th, 1913. After Rosa's parents separated, she and her mother moved to the farm where Rosa's grandparents lived. Rosa Parks was homeschooled until she was 11. She began high school, but she had to drop out to take care of her poor sick grandmother. It wasn't until after she was married that she finished high school. OMG. Whoa. By 1943, Rosa had become active in the civil rights movement. She joined her local NAACP chapter and the Voters League. Rosa worked as a seamstress at a department store. She rode the public bus to and from her work. After her arrest on December 1st, 1955, she spent the night in jail. Some people said that Rosa did not give up her seat because she was really tired. Rosa said that they were right. She was tired of giving in. Almost 100 years earlier, the Civil War had ended and slavery was abolished. Black people were no longer slaves, but in many places, real change did not come until the 1950s and 1960s. When the more black people began demanding their rights. Many people think that Rosa Parks' protest, that one little act, was the start of the modern civil rights movement. Black leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., met to discuss Rosa Parks' arrest. Martin and the others came up with a plan. They would not ride the city buses to school or work. This kind of protest is called a boycott. If the blacks of Montgomery stopped riding the buses, then the bus company would lose money. Perhaps then the government would change the laws. I sure hope so. On Monday, December the 5th, 1955, was the day that the boycott began. Since Monday was the start of a new school and work week, people would have to take cabs or find rides in cars. Some would even have to walk. But Martin believed the boycott should send a strong message. If black people couldn't sit wherever they wanted, they would refuse to take the buses. On Monday morning, Coretta and Martin woke up very early. They peeked out the window to look outside at the bus stop. A bus pulled up. It was empty. Martin jumped into his car and drove around the city. Almost all the black people he saw were riding in cars or walking. Later, he heard some had to walk more than 10 miles to get to where they were going. Whoa, such endurance. That is amazing. The first day of the boycott was a tremendous success, but it needed to continue. People would have to give up riding the buses the next day and the next day after that. They had to continue the boycott until the law changed. White leaders in the Montgomery City government were angry. The buses were losing money. But still, the leaders did not want to change their laws. So stubborn. Instead, they tried making things harder for black people. The police commissioner told the taxi companies to charge higher fares so that it would be too expensive for most people to take taxis. They would have no choice but to walk. But Martin and the other black leaders had a plan. They helped to organize carpools. Many people, both black and white, volunteered to drive people taking part in the boycott. It was a good example of peaceful protest. Peaceful protest, however, could be dangerous. Martin was arrested by the local police. They said he was speeding in his car. Martin knew that he was not. The police wanted to scare him into stopping the bus boycott. Then a firebomb was thrown onto the porch of his house. Martin was frightened for his family, but that did not stop him. The boycott lasted over a year. Finally, the Supreme Court of the United States said that the laws separating whites and blacks on the Montgomery buses had to end. Yes, they won! Yay! Martin was overjoyed. Now it was time for people to ride the buses again, sitting wherever they wanted. Early in the morning, on December 21st, in 1956, 3 other leaders of the boycott came to Martin's house. Reporters followed the men as they walked to the nearest bus stop. Oh yes, he's with reporters. He's gonna be in the news. Yay! The reporters shouted out questions. Cameras flashed in Martin's face. This was a momentous day. When the bus arrived, Martin and the other leaders got on. The reporters followed. Martin took a seat right up front. On his face was a great big smile. And I am so happy for him and all of the other African Americans. Chapter 5: A Peaceful Fight. Integrating the buses in Montgomery had worked, but Martin Luther King Jr. knew that this was just the beginning. Martin and other black leaders met in Atlanta, Georgia. They formed a civil rights group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. On February the 14th, 1957, Martin became the head of the group. In the South, civil rights leaders faced growing violence. One man's home was bombed. So were several churches. Then a service station and a cab stand were bombed. Martin urged everyone to remain calm. We must not return violence under any condition, he said. He knew that his advice was hard to follow. Martin's speeches made him famous in Montgomery. Wherever he went, thousands of people showed up to hear him. People even ran up to him on the street to ask for his autograph. On May 17th, 1957, Martin spoke at a gathering called the Prayer Pilgrimage in Washington, D.C. The march took place on the 3rd anniversary of the passage of Brown v. the Board of Education. On the day of the march, thousands of black and white people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. The speakers asked the government to pass a civil rights bill. This bill would guarantee all people in the United States equal rights This bill would guarantee all people in the United States equal rights under the law. An important part of the Civil Rights Bill would be to make sure every adult citizen was allowed to vote. At the prayer pilgrimage, Martin said that was the most urgent to request the President Dwight Eisenhower. While Martin was marching and speaking, Coretta was busy running the King household. On October 23rd, their second child, Martin Luther King III, was born. Martin said of Coretta, "I am indebted to my wife, Coretta, without whose love, sacrifices, and loyalty neither life nor work would bring fulfillment." By this time, Coretta wanted to become much more involved in the movement. Martin, however, preferred that she stay at home raising their children. The 15th Amendment. In 1870, the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution gave male U.S. citizens who were 21 or older the right to vote. Women, both white and black, did not get the right to vote until 1920. Aw, that's sad. But all over the South, black people were still kept from voting. They were told that they had to pay a, quote, poll tax before they could vote. Many were too poor to pay. Aww. Some blacks had to take tests to prove that they could read and write. If they couldn't, they were turned away. They could not vote for president. They could not vote for Congress. They could not vote for local leaders. Not only was this unfair, it was against the law. Come on. In 1959, Martin did agree to take Coretta along on a trip to India. Martin wanted to see the land where his hero Gandhi had lived. As he traveled through the country, he saw that India was divided between the very poor and the very rich. Many people did not have jobs. Many slept out on the streets. Rich people, on the other hand, had beautiful homes and fancy clothes. Yet, even with so much poverty, there was peace among the people. Yes, they were poor, but they did not take their troubles out on anyone. Not anyone at all. Martin visited some of the places that were special to Gandhi. He and his group went to a place called Bambi. It was there that Gandhi had started a walk of more than 200 miles to protest attacks on salt. Salt? The type that you put on your food? OMG. Gandhi's walk began with 8 people. The number grew to thousands. Some say that more than 1,000,000 people ultimately joined the walk. Gandhi told his people, "If you are hit, don't hit back. Even if they shoot at you, don't shoot back. Just keep moving." Martin had a wonderful experience in India. When he returned home, he was even more convinced of the power of peaceful protest. In 1959, the King family moved from Montgomery to Atlanta. It was hard to leave Montgomery, but Martin wanted more time for the civil rights work. He could not be a full-time minister. He told his congregation, "History has thrust something on me which I cannot turn away." In Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. would become the co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, his father's church. By the year 1960, the civil rights movement was spreading throughout the South. Black students and white students staged sit-ins at lunch counters. Students would sit together in a whites-only lunch counter and wait to be served. Often, the police would drag them out. But the students never fought back when arrested. Sometimes, people yelled and spit at the students. Some threw rocks at them. No matter how many students were put in jail, the next day, others would go, quote, sit in at the same lunch counters. They kept on because the fight was something they believed in. Martin took part in the sit-ins. On October 19th, 1960, he was arrested at a lunch counter in a department store in Atlanta. Over 200 students were arrested that same day. Whoa. They were all taken to the Fulton County Jail. Martin told the judge that the sit-ins pointed out racial injustice. He wanted to make the people in Atlanta see how wrong it was to have whites-only eating places. He said, "I must honestly say that we firmly believe that segregation is evil." 5 days passed, and Martin and the students were still in jail. Black people in Atlanta were very worried. Finally, the store owners dropped the charges, and everyone was set free. But many white people were still angry with Martin. They wanted him back in jail. That's crazy. On May 4th, 1960, the police stopped Martin in his car. They gave him a ticket for driving in Georgia with an Alabama driver's license. Martin thought, at worst, he'll just pay the fine in court. Instead, Martin was taken away, his legs put in chains, and driven to a state prison more than 200 miles away. The ride to the prison was long. Martin was hungry and he was thirsty. He was so scared. When his followers learned what had happened to Martin, they tried their best to get him out of prison. They made calls to Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy, who were running against each other for president. At first, neither man wanted to help. They were afraid of angering the white voters. When reporters asked Nixon about the Martin Luther King Jr. being in jail, Nixon said, "No comment." Sheesh, no comment? Seriously? Finally, one of Kennedy's friends convinced the senator to help. First, Kennedy called Martin's wife, Coretta. She was pregnant with their third child, and she was very upset. John F. Kennedy told Coretta that he and his brother Robert Kennedy, who was a lawyer, would do everything in their power to help Martin. Robert Kennedy called the judge who had sent Martin to jail. He wanted to know why Martin couldn't post bail. Bail is money paid to the court that allows someone to remain free until the trial. Now the judge agreed to set bail. Finally, Martin was freed. Kennedy campaign workers printed millions of leaflets that said Nixon's "no comment" remark showed that he was a man without a heart. Martin's father, Martin Luther King Sr., decided to vote for Kennedy now. John F. Kennedy won the election that November. He was the first Roman Catholic president. Catholics in the United States had faced prejudice too. That was one of the reasons many black people voted for JFK. Perhaps his own experience as a Catholic would make him more understanding of the problems of race in America. Chapter 6. Freedom Riders. Riding the bus in the front to freedom. Freedom Riders. By 1961, there were not as many whites-only lunch counters left in the South, but far too many waiting rooms, bathrooms, and restaurants and bus and train stations that still had separate areas for blacks and whites. It didn't matter that the court said this was illegal. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to President Kennedy, but the president did not take quick action to fix the situation. Aww. On May 4th, 1961, a group of students boarded 2 buses in Washington, D.C. They were traveling to the south. At some of the stops, the black students sat in the whites-only waiting rooms. Again, they were staging peaceful protests. In Anniston, Alabama, the tires of one of the buses were shot out. A bomb was thrown in the window of the other bus. As the frightened riders ran out of the bus, they were attacked. The trip was over. Oh, no more Freedom Riders. But the students did not give up. More groups rode buses from the north to the south. Again, students were attacked. Many were put in jail. again and again. These brave young people became known as Freedom Riders, riding the bus in the front of freedom. Freedom Riders. One night, a group of Freedom Riders held a meeting in a church in Montgomery, Alabama, where Martin came to speak. A crowd outside threw stones and bottles at the church, but Martin urged everyone inside to stay strong. Together, they sang the freedom song, "We shall overcome." Finally, the angry crowd left. Finally! Was this the end of segregation in these places? No. No. The bus station in Albany, Georgia, for example, refused to give up a whites-only waiting room. So a man named Dr. W.G. Anderson started a group called the Albany Movement. This group staged sit-ins and boycotts. For months, Martin led marches all over Albany. Once again, Martin was put in jail. Martin wanted to serve his sentence of 45 days. After only a couple of days, however, Martin was freed. He had been kicked off buses and out of stores, and now he was being kicked out of jail. Well, that's the best thing to be kicked out of, unless you're a bad person. Let's see. Yet after all the marches and still more time in jail, Martin led the rest of the leaders of the Albany Movement were faced with defeat. Oh, come on, defeat? The segregation laws in Albany remained, at least for the time being. While some people might have given up, Martin looked at the setback as a beginning. His fight would continue. Continue.